and welcome to another bonus edition of the Ask podcast, coming to you from half term on a lovely sunny bank holiday evening. We are going to carry on our cross-curricular theme. We're going to try and look at the intersection between science and literature. When I say we, it's me, Jenny Summers, again, Deputy Head of English and Drama, I had to think about that, at John Hampden Grammar School, and of course my lovely colleague, Mr. Mark Till.
Hello there. Yeah, well, should we full confession? We had a go at this, didn't we, in the afternoon? Outside, and there was a small child and a cat, and then someone over a garden fence using a buzzsaw. We had to abandon it. We didn't ask why he was using a buzzsaw. I hope he was a magician practicing or something.
Absolutely.
We probably should have asked, but yeah, this is take two, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. No, I mean, it was entertaining to listen back to, but I feel for our usual listeners, it might not have been quite what they were looking for. So we have.
No, I think Tom, the producer, would have despaired of us if he'd heard something.
Hopefully, there's no extras. Child is in bed, cats are, duly fed, etc. So hopefully, no interruptions, but I can't promise.
Let's do it.
Oh, and we will insert a clue, an update on clues and so on later on, I believe.
Well, there's a dramatic announcement to be made.
Oh my goodness.
It's dramatic for just a bonus episode, but we'll do it anyway.
Dun dun dun! But, they will, that's kept them teased, so they'll keep listening. Good. That's what we want. And as I say, we're going to look at the intersection between science and literature. And I get the feeling that Sir might be taking it possibly more in a non-fiction direction, whereas I'm looking at kind of science and its role in the novel. But you might, completely confound me by going away from that straight away. But where did you fancy starting, Sir?
No, I thought that. First of all, I thought that it's a little bit strange that I think a lot of people these days think that science and literature belong in completely separate realms. You have the C.P. Snow idea of the two cultures, and I think that's something that I regret, that's where we are. And I think historically that's fairly new. I think in the classical world, I think they would have seen arts and sciences as really the same kind of thing. Human beings want to find out about themselves and the world. I think in the Renaissance, I think Da Vinci would have seen a distinction between the arts and the sciences, between literature and science. So I think actually, I was thinking about this. This happens, doesn't it, with Romanticism? That you get this distinction where the Romantics, I think, rather feared science, and they feared that science was explaining everything and explaining everything away, and everything was becoming very mechanized. And John Keats uses the phrase "unweaving the rainbow," and he thought that science, in starting to explain optics and that a rainbow can be explained because of your perspective and where it's standing and trick of the light and so on, that science was taking away from the magic of reality. And I think that's almost still the influence, the dichotomy that we live under, and I think that's a shame. And we were talking earlier, you're off to see Richard Dawkins very soon, aren't you? And Richard Dawkins, if you set aside, he's now more associated, I guess, with the science and religion debate. But actually, for most of his career, Richard Dawkins was trying to correct that idea of unweaving the rainbow. In fact, he writes a book called Unweaving the Rainbow, in which he tries to argue that science, and indeed writing about science, ought to inspire the same kind of wonder and awe that Keats saw in nature. And Richard Dawkins' science is actually a way to have those feelings of the sublime and of awe, and he thinks that science should be more of an inspiring theme for artists, and that writers ought to be inspired by what science reveals about the world. And I think he's onto something. He's onto something there. And I read a lot of Richard Dawkins a few years ago. He writes some wonderful books, and he's a great example of a scientist who is also, I think, a very fine writer. Which is not always the same thing.
No.
Some scientists might have brilliant ideas, but they can't always communicate them. And Bill Bryson, who's a wonderful writer on many subjects, has this great anecdote in his A Short History of Nearly Everything, where he writes about the father of geology, who is James Hutton, who had this marvellous idea that basically founded the modern science of geology, about the composition of the Earth. But he wrote about it, his prose was so turgid and technical that actually his ideas never took off. And it took another scientist who was a far better writer, John Playfair, to write about it in a way that was far more accessible for a popular audience. And so when you think about science and literature, I think to some extent they're at their best when they're working together. I think scientists need to popularise their ideas through literature, and someone like Richard Dawkins, I think, is a really good example of a scientist who does that. And of course he's friends with Douglas Adams for a lot of his life, until Douglas Adams dies tragically young, and is a chap who wrote the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy stories. And they had a friendship, and you can sort of see that Douglas Adams was really inspired by ideas in science, and scientific ideas filter their way into his comedy in Hitchhiker's Guide. And equally, I think Richard Dawkins is sort of inspired by the lightness of touch that Douglas Adams had, and he writes another book called Climbing Mount Improbable, which is all about trying to explain the evolution of the human eye. And he uses this metaphor that it's like climbing an improbable mountain. You can just tell he gets that kind of thing from Douglas Adams. So I think there's a really useful exchange to be had between science and literature, and it's a shame that people don't always recognise that, and that they're like friends who should hang out more, and yet they keep apart, which I think is a shame.
Do you think it's about, just listening to what you say, is it about a need for a narrative? Is there some kind of inherent human desire for everything to have a kind of underlying sense of story, and that just, dry statistics, facts, experiments don't speak to us, speak to our hearts? We need a narrative to underpin everything.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is true. And again, not to harp on about Richard Dawkins, but, he does write another book called The Ancestor's Tale. He tries to explain evolution through this idea of stories and almost the human story. Yeah, I think that's one part of it. I think another part of it is making ideas accessible through metaphor. I think that the great science writers, someone like Richard Feynman, for example, in physics, they often try and use the same imaginative techniques that a fiction writer would use, and metaphors are very powerful. I think it's though double-edged. That's why I really hope we can get Mr. Dunn or Dr. Bullard on the podcast at some point when we're back doing regular episodes to talk about this, because I think it's that thing where metaphors can be double-edged. They can help you to explain something, but fundamentally there's a limit to how useful they are. So I remember being taught at school about the composition of an atom, and that electrons were like flies buzzing around in a cathedral. And I remember having that, and what the teacher was trying to convey in that was a sense of scale and how much empty space there is in an atom, particles within it. But actually, the more you learn about physics, and particularly as you become older and study at a higher level, and our students who are studying at A level, they have to learn that actually that metaphor is not very useful. On a certain level, it's nothing like flies buzzing around a cathedral, because both of those are physical objects that we can understand, and the whole point of physics at a subatomic level actually becomes strange, and you start to get that whole particle wave duality, and things don't behave in a way that's predictable. So yeah, I think there's another tension between the way that you want to try and use language to explain by analogy, and that can only take you so far, and to some extent that can end up almost being a sort of lie that then teachers have to say, oh, well, we used to explain it like this, but that was sort of just to help you get to a certain point. Now we have to kick that ladder away and do something else. So yeah, I think narrative and also imaginative description, I think, are intersections.
I had that exact experience at chemistry AS level of these were the things we used to try and help you understand GCSE. You can forget everything you've learned. We're now going to explain it in a far more technical way and then bamboozle you all over again. So yeah, no, I absolutely recognise that idea.
So that's what it made me think. Also, Vladimir Nabokov and his butterflies.
Okay.
These guys. I was trying to think of writers who had a sort of scientific background.
Yeah.
I thought, or use I thought A.S. Byatt.
Yes.
She's very scientific. She writes Possession Trust, lots of other novels. And she seems to me to be someone who's very, very science literate. Tom Stoppard.
Oh, yeah.
Tom Stoppard, when he plays like Arcadia, someone who's incredibly science literate. And then I thought Vladimir Nabokov and his butterflies. So Vladimir Nabokov, who is a slightly controversial writer, because he writes Lolita.
Of course.
Which if you look it up, we won't get into that too much on the podcast.
Don't look it up. Don't look it up.
He writes a bunch of really beautiful novels. And he is a butterfly expert. Well, not a butterfly expert, he was a lepidopterist. And there's something about his study, I think, of moths and butterflies, which is a favourite subject of our very own Miss Fenn as well. And he's a proper scientist, and that absolute attention to detail, I think, finds its way into his novels and his imaginative writing too. He has almost a kind of scientific precision to the way that he describes everything, even in his imaginative fiction. And so there are some writers, and you think, oh, your scientific approach actually really strengthens your imagination. So that's where I went. But because you went a different direction. You were thinking of science in fiction.
Yeah.
Right?
And interestingly, that the last thing you said just made me, I don't know why, it sent sparks going off in my brain or whatever it is, scientifically speaking. It made me think of Middlemarch, interestingly, because I think Eliot, I mean, she was a polymath. She was good at all sorts of things, incredible writer, incredible intellect, and often way beyond anything I can achieve. But she often used lots of kind of scientific metaphors and ideas in her writing, and she would use the idea of looking at people under a microscope, and even talks about the kind of the art of moving people into places and observing how different things cause them to move in different ways. And she even studies the idea, like she looks at the poor old Dr. Lydgate, the kind of the frustrated doctor that has this, like, wants to come up with a unifying theory that makes the world make sense, and his kind of great disappointment when he, marries the wrong woman and never has his great success and so on. So I think she's a writer that's really has an interesting view of the interrelation between science and literature. So I definitely recommend her. And don't let the length of the book put you off, because I know some people look at it.
It's been a while since I've read any George Eliot, but George Eliot is
she's a master.
The absolute real deal.
Yeah, no, I definitely recommend her. But yeah, really, one of the things that encouraged me the first place to pick this is I really wanted to talk about Never Let Me Go, the Kazuo Ishiguro novel, obviously Ishiguro being one of your previous clues. And previous Nobel Prize winner a couple of years ago as well. I just think I'm going to try very hard not to spoil this, but it really is a book that looks at ethics. It looks like the interplay between science and ethics and how that overlaps with literature. And it kind of looks at, what does it mean to be human? What, if you boil it all down, both in a scientific sense, but in a more of a, I don't know, not a religious sense, but a spiritual sense perhaps, what at base makes us human? If we are from a test tube, if we're cloned, if we are partly bionic, if we're augmented in some way, do we lose our humanity? If our consciousness is uploaded onto a system of some description, do we then cease to be human? So what is it that makes us? Is it consciousness? Is it the ability to feel? Is it the ability to feel love? And I think he gets at all of those things through a really fascinating, seemingly to start with quite detached first-person narrator, that gradually, when she starts telling all these little vignettes of her life growing up in a seemingly ordinary boarding house in the British countryside, and then the kind of uncanny sense of things are not quite normal at all, and the things that are lurking underneath, and the ethical sense of, is this right, what is happening here? Again, I'm trying really hard not to spoil it, but it's a tearjerker. I mean, Ishiguro is the master of making you cry in a good way.
Is it on our recommended list? Is it on our 16?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it's on 16.
I remember thinking it's the sort of novel that even if you haven't particularly been into fiction or read novels before, I think there are a lot of our students who they would pick that up and it would become their favourite novel. It's so incredibly powerful.
I agree with you. I mean, it's on the A-level syllabus. It's not one that's on our part of the A-level syllabus, but it is, and it's a brilliant, again, a political and social protest novel, my favourite of all the modules. It really gets at those kind of issues, and he's great at these kind of cross-genre approaches. I've just bought, I haven't started it yet, but Clara and the Sun, his new novel, which is about, very similar in terms of themes, but looking at an artificial intelligence that's seemingly almost impossible to tell the difference between whether she's real or not, and again, how should society treat her, and what
Turing
should she...
test, if someone would pass the Turing test.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So do you think is that the role of writers, or one of the roles of literature? Do you think science proposes potential futures or potential breakthroughs or potential dangers, and writers create fictional worlds to explore the limits of them?
Yeah.
That's one of the functions of literature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I definitely think that. I mean, that's the power of the imagination. One could say that it can create a sense of paranoia. I mean, certainly, to go back to the AI example, that it means everybody's like, well, it's going to end up being like iRobot, and they're all going to take over, and it's going to be the end of the world. So you could argue perhaps that stories and comics and so on might, stimulate our imagination too much, but I think that is what writers are there for. I think that they need to explore the boundaries of what's possible, to sort of highlight to us, it's alert, say, this could happen if we carry on that course. This is the kind of dystopian future we might create for ourselves. So I think, and that's obviously one of the most common features of science in the novel, is in that kind of various different horrible dystopian futures we could create ourselves if we do X, Y, and Z, and we carry on exploring this particular path. And I particularly like that genre too.
Do you think literature's to blame in some way for people's suspicion of science? Do you think that the writers always focusing on the dystopian potential of science and technology? Actually, there's an argument to say that's been overdone and has almost contributed to a feeling of, with any breakthrough, people tend to catastrophize and think about what's the worst that can happen. And I wonder if that almost, are we in a culture that maybe isn't as scientifically literate, and is that because we fear it, I wonder?
Oh, I don't like the sound of that. I mean, you could you could say that COVID in a way bears that out, because sometimes there is you get certain people that do seem to distrust the scientific voice, and sometimes because they're hearing narratives from elsewhere, kind of disinformation and misinformation, and the narrative is more, hey, I've heard this, I'm going to believe that narrative rather than that person spouting his dry scientific approach. So I suppose to some extent I'm going to blame journalists more than I'm going to blame novelists. I'm going to cling to the novels. But no, I think it's a fair criticism, but I still think that it's important for artists of all types to signpost, to give warning signs that, they are the bastions of a free society. So I think they have to guard that freedom and warn against anything that could potentially infringe upon our future.
No, well put. I was thinking too, science and literature, and I thought, have there been many books that have had a bigger disrupting impact than Darwin's On the Origin of Species?
No.
We has to say, I mean, things are really different after that book's published. And I know that Alfred Russel Wallace comes up with ideas at the same time in a different place, but it's straight. We teach 19th century novels, don't we? And often that is a contextual moment that challenges and disrupts, and it alters the way that people think about religion and think about human history and think about themselves and so on. But people still don't understand it very well. You get very, very common misconceptions about evolution. People thinking that, we evolved from chimpanzees or something. We've not properly understood that. And I wonder again if that's that's the difficulty, isn't it? Really taking something, scientific concepts, how you make them through language and through explanation, how you popularize them. And I guess there's almost a genre, isn't it? Popular science. How you take big ideas and get them out there and make them palatable for a general readership.
Yeah.
And there's real art to that, because often these ideas are so easy to misunderstand.
No, absolutely, and it just makes Jekyll and Hyde is the perfect example of that, because coming not a great deal of time after On the Origin of Species, Descent of Man, etc. And yet, really, its fascination is less with evolution than de-evolution, with atavism and so on. So, like the backlash, the corresponding fear. If we can go that way, surely we can go backwards and you know, undo ourselves. We can create the Mr. Hydes of the world. So it shows that, yeah, even a positive thing of discovering something as monumental as that can spark all of these not so positive offshoots. And phrenology, of course, the idea that, you know, oh yes, we can study the shape of your brain and it can tell me you've got this really good, oh, you've got a great forehead going on there, Mr. Till. Oh, I can tell you're a good guy. You know, smooth-faced gentleman. Yeah, absolutely. I can trust you straight down the line. So yeah, no, absolutely. It is difficult that you get these popular conceptions and reactions and rewritings. And it's a bit like giant kind of Chinese whispers, if one is allowed to use that phrase anymore. I don't know if there's a more politically correct way I can put that. But yeah, so as it's passed on from person to person, it can degrade. And I don't know, you know, perhaps we, again, as you say, we need to talk to the scientists. How can we make sure that their ideas are communicated in a way that fits with them? Perhaps we need to, you know, I don't know, shadow them and write novels about them. I don't know. A novel about Dr. Bullard.
Get more cross department interaction.
I
think there should be poems written about you know, string theory, and I was really encouraging. So we did the book I love most. Honestly, that feels like years ago. That was in the autumn. That was the autumn of this year, this academic year, and I was really encouraged. So many of our students actually recommended science books. So we had I mentioned Richard Feynman.
Yeah.
Richard Feynman's autobiography got a number of mentions. Brief History of Time.
Yes.
That was their favourite book. There were some Simon Singh's maths books. So it is actually encouraging that a lot of students, I think, are reading some works of science and popular science.
Yeah, those kind of literary style science as well. I mean, that's the thing about Hawking. He wrote absolutely beautifully. He's very, you know, although complex ideas and he's breaking them down, he writes in a really beautiful way. So yeah, no, I completely agree. After we started having this conversation earlier, I just randomly came up on Twitter. It was talking about Carl Sagan and his recommended books. It made me a little bit sad, because I'd read so few of them, so it made me feel a bit inadequate. But it also, there were lots of philosophical books in there, but there were almost no novels. So that did make me a little bit sad. I mean, there was, but I mean, there were obviously some fantastic books in there, and I won't take away from it. But I did think, no, this does not feel like a complete reading list for, you know.
On the poetry of science, though, I think Carl Sagan is worth. Have you seen Cosmos? Have you seen the TV series?
I've seen little clips of it on YouTube.
Yeah. So if people are listening and haven't, Carl Sagan's Cosmos, any clip of it at all, there you've got that we started talking about people who can popularise science. And I think there's no one who did that really more poetically than Carl Sagan. And he makes that series in the 80s, and it was right under the it was right in the midst of the threat of nuclear annihilation, Cold War at the time. And you know, he mentions that, and he's almost trying to use science as a vehicle to bring people together. You know, saying, look, that science is almost the common shared human endeavor, and you know, we need to put aside our differences. We've got a universe out there to explore. It's wonderfully poetic about it, and he writes a book called something like Science as a Candle in the Dark. He saw that need to understand as being the thing that was lighting our way from the sort of darkness of superstition. So I'd completely forgotten about Carl Sagan and Cosmos. I'm going to look up some clips. That was a genuinely marvelous TV series.
I will go back and have a look. I do like nowadays. Neil deGrasse Tyson is very enjoyable. He's maybe not Carl Sagan, but he is very enjoyable as well. That's interesting, that idea, obviously enlightenment and that idea of discovery and so on, because as you say, he was trying to impress upon us the role of science for good. But we do get so many of these amazing books that are reactions against in the Enlightenment and reactions against full-throated technological progress. Like I was just thinking of things like Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, and often Dickens in various different forms, as like particularly technology such as, you know, trains, and how they're so disruptive, and how the creation of new machines has these detrimental effects upon individual people's lives because it puts them out of jobs. So it's interesting, there's so many of these books that see technology as a threat, and obviously that's still something that happens today, and it's interesting that unfortunately seems to be one of the big themes, the idea of technology and all the ways it can negatively impact our world rather than how it can advance it.
Yeah, which is a little unfair, science, isn't it? Because I guess science is just understanding. Technology is what human beings decide to do with that understanding. And unfortunately, probably we know that if we become able to do something, then we probably will do it for
Absolutely.
good or ill. But I do feel that's when I started by saying that the Romantics were reacting against science. I think they were probably more reacting against what was being done with science, and with what was clearly becoming some of the effects of the Industrial Revolution. And that's I think probably people's fear about change as well. You know, scientific discovery is fundamentally about, here's something new, things are going to change, and I think people have a fear of change.
No, I absolutely agree. And
sometimes well founded, and sometimes not well founded.
No,
there's an awful lot that, you know, we might say would be nice to change. There's still a great many diseases that cause you know, untold amounts of suffering and lives cut short and things like that. You know, it often strikes me that there's an awful lot still to be done in terms of recovery. We tend to think that we're very technologically advanced, yet, you know, people still succumb to illnesses that you know, we keep being told a cure's around the corner. But somewhere, I think we still need to get behind science, because there's a great deal still to do.
I wonder if there'll be the great COVID vaccine novel of the future. Is that something somebody's going to write? Are you writing that right now, sir?
I should be, shouldn't I? I think very possibly. I wonder, and I do wonder whether the development of that is going to affect, you know, public perceptions of science. I've actually been rather in awe of not just those working in healthcare, but I think there's genuine public admiration for those who have led on the incredibly fast production of the various vaccines. And I think that kind of generosity of spirit that exists at the moment towards people that have worked on finding a solution to this problem, I think feels like the potential to change the public mood a little bit. Because, as I say, I've always thought people are a little suspicious, a little hostile towards scientists. I think something a little bit anti-human, there's something a bit cold and clinical and white-coated about the whole thing. And it has the reaction to the vaccine is potentially a chance to show that, you know, a lot of the people working in those white coats are actually doing it for real human benefit and to alleviate suffering. And, you know, what's more human than that?
Yeah, it's been, you know, just to go topical, I saw a video of thousands of people lined up, because apparently they've opened up in some places for vaccine for just over 18s, anyone can go. And it was really encouraging to see the narrative, I guess, and the scientists have persuaded them, so many people, to come forward, except for they're getting their vaccine before me, because I booked mine for next week, which I think is, you know, they better leave some for me, otherwise I'm not going to be happy. I'm going to be marching down there and complaining. No, I'm absolutely, you know, encourage anyone 18 and over that's allowed to go and get it and to benefit from that. And that's been a lovely sense of the collective good and the what's possible to do when we put our minds to it. So I just want to bring things in a more positive spin, because I'm aware I feel like I've been bringing all of the doom and gloom. I'm trying to think of any.
Go back to doom and gloom. What else was on your doom and gloom list?
My doom and gloom list had
the Triffids on. You had John Wyndham on your list as well.
Yes, I did. Gosh, that's well remembered.
I was looking at Mr. Summers' notes.
I know, that's not fair. I haven't looked at your notes because you haven't got any. Because you've just got a brain full of ideas. I need to write things down to process them. But yeah, no, I'm a huge fan. I haven't read some of his for a while, but obviously Day of the Triffids is the one that most people know of. But actually my favourite of his that I've read was more Midwich Cuckoos, which is a really odd, fascinating little book with some mysterious golden-eyed babies that become mysterious golden-eyed children. This kind of idea of the kind of alien-like creatures among us, and how that would impact upon us, and should we see them as a threat to our future civilization, should we integrate them, and that kind of thing. And it's a slightly unsettling book, it's fair to say, which most of his books are. But no, it's a really interesting study in rather dystopian, but also slightly like frighteningly possible. He creates such a clear sense of realism whilst bringing in little things. You think, okay, well that doesn't really happen, but you think, well, could it really happen? So it's kind of makes it more creepy and a little bit on the uncanny side.
Oh, I haven't read that. I'll have to read those. We haven't mentioned H.G. Wells. How is it possible to mention science and literature? We haven't yet mentioned it.
It's on my list. It's on my notes. I promise.
It's on your list?
It is.
Of course, it's on your list. Because I was thinking, it's a very cliched story, but there might be a couple of listeners who don't know about it. Of course, the famous Orson Welles broadcast of the world. So many people, maybe not quite so many, as it's become a bit of an apocryphal story that people listened to it on the radio and thought it was a real alien invasion. But certainly there were some people who were concerned that it was a real incident. And H.G. Wells is an innovator. In the time machine really popularizes the scientific idea of time travel, which these days is an absolute staple, isn't it? Of fiction on TV and film and books and things. But H.G. Wells was, I guess, that great example of somebody who used scientific concepts to write the most wonderful speculative fiction that had a huge impact on the popular imagination.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think I'm right in saying this was before H.G. Wells, but I think E.M. Forster wrote Time Stops before War in the World. I might be wrong.
They were the same. I think they were a similar generation.
Yeah. But he's just not a writer, it's just very, 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 very different to Room with a View and so on and so forth. It's not something I associate him with at all. But it's quite fascinating.
Tell people about The Machine Stops. It's a short story.
It's a short story. I'm just trying to remember the details of it. Now I've brought it up and I'm trying to remember exactly what happens. But
he predicts the internet, doesn't he? This idea that everybody is in their own little isolation, almost in their own little pot, and they all communicate like we're communicating.
Yeah.
Through what he calls the machine, which is a vast interface that connects everybody. And one day, the machine stops.
Dun, dun, dun.
Technology, as it were, fails. But he's writing all this. This is in the 1910s, isn't it? He writes this incredibly early. And not just the idea of the technology, but the isolating and somewhat alienating effect that it would have on people. That people would actually live in their little isolations and just communicate that way. He basically anticipates, Netflix,
echo chambers and so on.
Yeah, and people just being in their own little bubbles, but actually physically very isolated from each other.
Well, but we are bridging the gap, sir. We are talking digitally across the internet in order to further communication and knowledge, we hope.
Yes, we are.
I don't know if that's too ambitious. I tell you what, I have to talk about. There's one thing I haven't talked about. I don't know if you've ever read Flowers for Algernon. Have you ever read that?
Oh, yeah, well, yes, but not for a long time. But yeah, no, interesting.
That one, I absolutely just love. Again, I don't want to spoil it, so I'm just trying to think how much I can sketch out. But it's fascinatingly written, because you start reading it and it's almost, you just think, I can't read this. What's going on? Because the way it's written is a kind of diary type format from this man's point of view. And to start with, it's very simplistic. It's very, very difficult to read. And through the process of the book, he undergoes a kind of experiment which kind of supercharges his IQ and just entirely transforms him as a person. So the prose changes completely. And it's really about, again, does that transform you? Do you become a different human being? Are you worth the same? It's about, should that person who can only just kind of has got the minimum IQ necessary for even speaking, should they be worth any different amount to the superhuman IQ that then is, trying to use as much of his time as he can to create inventions and come up with solutions to incredible problems, and how society deals with this huge gap. We have to make a society that encapsulates the people that don't have the IQ. They still need to have purpose and meaning and so on, and shouldn't they have as much of a role in society as the person with the superhuman IQ, and again, a massive tearjerker. I seem to pick these; they seem to be my favourites, but it's a really fascinating book.
Yeah, the big emotional punch books you're going for.
Absolutely.
That's true. Do you know, I have a confession to make. So when I was probably just about 20 or something like that. So, not very long ago, it says. I started to read a lot of these theories about how humanity would augment itself, and in particular how alongside that machines would become, essentially super intelligent and take over. And what was that futurist? Was it Ray Kurzweil? Had these theories about the singularity. Singularity was when the next huge advance in computer technology would be invented by a computer. So humans would be cut out of it entirely, and supercomputers would invent the next upgrade to the supercomputer. And essentially you get a race of incredibly intelligent computers, and humanity would be reduced to a sort of secondary species. I became genuinely frightened about this. And I suddenly started thinking, oh well, that's it. That's the game up for humanity then. And I remember watching sort of documentaries about human history with a sort of sense of nostalgia and thinking, oh, this is the sort of twilight of the human project, heading for this technological future. And I still think that I think the time scale might be wrong, but there's still part of me that has a slight twinge when you hear about people starting to augment their physicality, their biology with technology, and how long we're going to last in our current biological forms.
Yeah.
I do read a lot of these with interest, but also with a kind of fear, actually, about these huge leaps forward. And as you say, you have to ask yourself big questions like, what is value? A lot of the singularity stuff was based on the idea that everything's about computing power. Eventually we'll harness huge astronomical objects to build massive supercomputers, and it's all about knowledge and computing power and things becoming more intelligent. And I do remember having a moment where I suddenly thought, but is intelligence the only thing that matters? Based on intelligence as the thing, It's like, well, what if it's actually not about becoming more intelligent? What if it's about becoming more compassionate?
Yeah.
Or kind or decent or generous? And an awful lot of futurology seems to focus on intelligence at the expense of actually other human qualities. And as soon as I realised that, I started to feel a little bit better.
Because I guess that's eugenics is the perfect example of that, of pursuit of intelligence to that nth degree without compassion, that coldness, that terrifying idea of, we can build the perfect human. And
it's the Dr. H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was really caught up in that eugenics movement. So many writers were, incredibly, you would think, very humane writers. But before people saw, I suppose, in the Second World War, the logical end to some of that thinking, there were a great many writers, a lot of the Bloomsbury set, apparent liberals, left-wing people, they're very, very seduced by eugenics. And, that's a warning too, I think.
You're killing my love of some of my favourite writers and artists. Don't do this.
Well, people aren't perfect, are they? People make mistakes, and
I think the debate on whether we can separate the art from the artist is probably for another day, because that could be a whole wormhole, rabbit hole to go down. Definitely.
That's a podcast episode right there.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure we can find a good guest for that one. But any more things you would like to add to that? I think we've had a good wide-ranging discussion.
No, I think that's. I think they were the things that came to mind. I'd be really interested to see what some of our science colleagues have to say.
Make of our witterings and whether any of them were.
If anyone's listened all this way, by the way, you've done well. I think if you've got this far, we salute you. No, competition. Should we do competition?
Yay, do it.
Somebody won.
We
had 4 clues in the 4 proper episodes, and somebody eventually emailed the right answer, and it was Dylan G. I say, almost about to say his surname, but G. It was Dylan G. in year 11. Who's on that? So he will receive his prize, which I think will be a voucher for Blackwell's in Oxford.
Ooh. Very nice.
Blackwell, so that you can go to Blackwell's, which is a wonderful bookshop. If you haven't been, Blackwell's kind of in the shadow of the Bodleian Library in the Sheldonian Theatre, and all of that. Wonderful, wonderful bookshop. And he successfully emailed that what was going on. So the clues were Dickens, and then Austen, and then Voltaire, and Ishiguro. And he successfully deduced that I was spelling Da Vinci.
Oh, how did I not get
Da
that?
Vinci from the names of writers.
Oh,
He was the only one to tumble to that.
I'm so sad I didn't get that. Fair enough.
So next time we do an episode, that'll be at the beginning of a new and very different kind of cryptic clue set and another prize in the offing. So we reboot, and it's all to play for again.
It was very cryptic crossword, wasn't it? My brain was going. I was looking for links between the actual authors. Darn it! You tricked
people
me.
were so excited to email in and say, "Are they all writers?" I say, "Yeah, they are all writers, but there's a little bit more to it than that."
Yeah. I managed that far. I got as far as that. That was about it. Oh,
Dylan G, congratulations.
well done. You've got a better brain than me, clearly. Brilliant. Okay, so we better round off with, thank you to ourselves for, for doing this and producing it, and hopefully it'll sound okay. But thank you for Tom and the production team for, not minding when I emailed you the previous podcast, and hopefully not minding this time either. And thank you guys for listening and for all your comments. We're starting to get some lovely emails and Google Classroom messages and questions. And please do, as Sir said before, if you want to come on as a panelist, if you want to come as a guest, if you want to suggest a topic that you think other people or ourselves should explore, please do. We want this to be an interactive experience. We don't want to be speaking into the void, because that's,
No, because it might start speaking back to us.
Oh my gosh. Yep, there you go. There's your novel idea right there, sir. There we go. I've solved that one. Apart from your vaccine novel that you've got to write as well, or screenplay, whatever you fancy.
You're busy.
Yeah, I need you, keep these, because you haven't got anything to do, CAGs and tags and whatever other acronyms that you can come up with. And of course, please follow us on Twitter at JHGS English and at JHGSHW. Is there a science one?
There's a science one too. We have to on this episode tell people to follow JHGS Science.
There we go. Absolutely. They're very good at visuals. Actually, I'm quite impressed. They're incredible experiments that they've put pictures up of that made me quite envious. Made me want to be in the labs with them. Perhaps they'll invite us one day. Perhaps we can do a swap. Anyway, I'm thinking aloud, which is always a dangerous thing. And then subscribe to us on YouTube, under my name, which is Jenny with an I Summers. Follow us on Spotify. Listen to us on Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere. Anywhere that you can think of that there's a podcast, we're there. So join us on the journey, to use a lovely overused metaphor. And keep listening and give us suggestions for anything for the future. So it remains just to say goodbye and thank you very much.
Yes, bye. Take care.
See you soon.
Listen again. Keep listening.
Yeah, just re-listen. Listen, get our viewing figures and listening figures up. Thanks.